Has anyone ever told you that you were the problem, just to avoid blame?
I wish I could tell you I was surprised, that I woke up hopeful and then the day flipped upside down. But the truth is I woke up already braced for the usual diplomatic silence, because that had become the pattern over the last 4 birthdays. A pattern where the texts arrived late or not at all, and the excuses were practical and tidy, and somehow always landed in my lap like I should be the one to understand, because I am the one who handles things and understands things and keeps things moving. And I was ready to swallow it again until the moment I opened my phone and saw a carousel of photos of my sister standing at an airport under a big banner about a surprise trip abroad, smiling in every shot while our parents tagged each other with captions about how family shows up for family and how she deserved the world. And the timestamp sat there like a dare because it was my day, not next week or last month, my actual birthday. And I just stared at it thinking, you did not forget me, you replaced me. I do not need a party with candles or a restaurant where they clap and bring out a free dessert, and honestly, I would rather not have the awkward toast where someone says something generic and calls it heartfelt, because I am not after the show. I am after the feeling that I matter to the people I learned to matter to, and over the last 4 years I watched that feeling shrink while the celebrations for my sister got louder and bigger and more public, each one a little campaign with coordinated posts and videos and the kind of speeches you make when you want the whole world to see how good you are at loving. And it would have been one thing if we were all the same kind of ignored, if life had just gotten messy and everyone had slipped, but it was not that. It was very specific, because I was the dependable one who drove mom to appointments and fixed dad's insurance portal and took my niece on school shopping runs when money was tight, and somehow that meant my day became the one that could be postponed, downgraded, quietly erased. When I tell you about the first year they skipped it, I can still hear my mom on the phone saying it snuck up on them and that we would do something later, and later never came. But I forgave it because life happens and I do not keep score like a petty auditor. The second year came with an unexpected bill and a promise that we would combine celebrations the next time we were all together, which did not happen because schedules are busy and my sister's job had a big launch they needed to support with a weekend trip, so my name slid down the priority list again. The third year they sent an evening text that said they hoped I had treated myself and that they were proud of me, which would have felt nice if 48 hours earlier they had not posted a video of a restaurant full of friends raising glasses to my sister's half-birthday because she had been feeling down and they wanted to lift her up. And I let that one go by telling myself I was being dramatic, that I should not compare, that grown women handle their own birthdays anyway. Then came this year, and I had made peace with keeping it quiet because I have a job that keeps me tired and I was not planning anything major beyond a call with a friend and maybe takeout, and I was fine with that until I saw those photos. The luggage and the happy captions and the comments from cousins saying this is what love looks like, and something in me just clicked into place. Not a shout and not a breakdown, more like a door closing softly in a house where everyone else is talking too loudly to notice, and the list of small moments stacked up in my head in a way I could not unstack anymore. The times I picked up when my sister needed a ride because her car battery died again. The night I stayed up late sorting through dad's banking alerts because he had accidentally paid a bill twice. The weekend I canceled plans to help mom sort insurance paperwork while she told me I was the steady one. And all of that would be enough to keep showing up except for the part where showing up seemed to buy me less and less place at the table. You know those families where there is a golden child who somehow never has to explain and a helper who always does, and no one says it out loud because it sounds ugly. But the roles are clear in the way money gets spent and attention gets directed and praise gets distributed like dessert, where one person has to earn a slice and the other gets the whole pie just for showing up. That is us, and I had been pretending it was not. Because I do not like living in categories and I do not want to be the narrator who keeps telling you how unfair it is while still showing up to scrub the dishes. But the side-by-side of my quiet birthday and my sister's surprise trip plastered everywhere turned the volume up so high I could not stay in denial. And there I was, sitting with a phone in my hand and a choice about whether I was going to keep begging for crumbs from a table I kept setting I did not text anyone to ask why, because I already knew the answer would be a web page of excuses and a gift card thrown on top, and I am too old to train my nervous system to be grateful for afterthoughts, so I did the smallest, calmest thing that I knew would matter to me more than any speech, which was to stop carrying the invisible load they had grown very comfortable letting me carry. The kind of load that does not look like a banner, but keeps a family machine humming, and even as I thought that, I could hear the voice in my head that always says be nice, be patient, people are flawed, and I decided I could still be kind without being a doormat, which sounds simple until you actually try it with people you love. I kept my phone face down for a while, and I thought about how many times I had picked up the dinner bill because I make steady money and it seemed easier. How I had covered the shared streaming bundle because it was on my card from the early days when I set it up for everyone. How the family phone plan autopay still ran through my bank because I had fixed it after a late fee a couple of years back and we never moved it off. How I am the admin on the family photo album and the organizer on the group chat because I create folders and label things and remember passwords. And it hit me that I had been the infrastructure around which they performed, the stagehand who keeps the lights on while the star takes her bow, and if I stayed in that role, I was going to keep reading captions about love while my name stayed off the marquee. So I took a breath and made a quiet decision that felt more like self-respect than vengeance, because I am not trying to ruin anyone's life. I am trying to stop subsidizing the version of theirs where I am a prop. And I opened the wireless account and removed my payment method with the option to end at the close of the current cycle. And then I did the same with the streaming bundle and the family cloud storage that I have been paying for. And I exported the shared photo album in case anyone wants copies later, but I toggled off my ownership because I am done maintaining a museum of memories that room temperature ignore me, and finally, because I know exactly how they view messaging as community, I quietly turned off my role as group chat organizer so that when the system asked for a new owner it would not be me, and I did all of that without a single announcement, because I do not owe a press release for boundaries. It did not feel like a tantrum, and it did not feel like revenge for revenge's sake. It felt like finally matching my actions to my reality, and as I set the phone down again, I realized how steady my hands were. Which is funny because this would be the part where you expect shaking or tears, but there was just a clean, simple calm, the kind you get when you stop arguing with the math in front of you, and if you were wondering whether I reached out to say any of this to them, I did not, because I have said versions of it before in gentler shapes and the message never landed, and this time I wanted the actions to speak first and let the silence do the explaining. I wish I could tell you they noticed right away, but people who are used to being centered rarely notice a shift until the lights flicker, and the lights had not flickered yet, not for them, not on that day. Not while the comments kept rolling in under my sister's photos and my name did not appear anywhere, and that is fine, because I am not looking for immediate justice. I am setting up something that will not need my voice to carry it. And I am not going to warn them or defend myself or translate my choices into something palatable for people who have shown me exactly how far their version of love travels. By the time they feel it, it will register in a way that a text never could, and when it does, they will come looking for the old me. The one who fixes, funds, and forgives on demand, and I am telling you now, that version has left the building. And the next part is where things start to get loud. I did not announce anything because I have learned that announcements only give people time to rehearse their lines and angle for sympathy, so instead I let the quiet do the job that my careful words never managed to finish. And after I pulled my cards off the shared payments and transferred my ownership off the little systems I had built for everyone, I opened the contacts on my phone and, with a steady hand I did not know I had until that moment, I blocked my parents, my sister, the cousins who measure love with likes, and the relatives who never call unless they need a ride or a referral. Because I wanted the first moment they realized something had shifted to be the moment where they could not route around me with a guilt text or a midnight voicemail that would have me driving across town at dawn. You would think that kind of move would feel dramatic or cruel, yet what it felt like was an alignment, the way a chiropractor adjusts a vertebra that has been out of place for years. And once the list was done, I sat there hearing the old voice that always says be the bigger person and do not make a scene, and I answered that voice with a simple truth, which is that refusing to keep playing the unpaid stagehand is not a scene, it is a boundary, and that if my worth to the family rises and falls on how easily I can be reached for labor while being routinely skipped for care, then the only honest step is to make sure I am not reachable for labor anymore until respect catches up. The first hour was nothing, because of course it was. They were busy congratulating themselves under my sister's vacation photos and drafting another caption about how she inspires them to be brave, and I let that roll. Because their performance is not my problem, and a part of me has always suspected that if you took the audience away, the show would collapse under its own weight. Yet I am not here to test theories for science. I am here to stop bleeding out in small cuts. So I turned my focus to the practical scraps I had left lying around in the name of being helpful, the shared family storage plan that I pay for because it once solved a photo crisis, the streaming bundle I set up during a holiday because I was tired of arguing about passwords, the family phone plan I rescued after a late fee that made everyone panic, and the random subscriptions that ended up on my card because I am the one who reads fine print and remembers renewal dates. I did not yank the plug on anything mid-month because I am not vindictive and I do not need the satisfaction of watching a movie cut out halfway through a scene. So I set every change to land at the end of the cycle and documented it cleanly so no one could claim I scorched the earth. But I did remove my payment method and my admin status right away, which meant that when the reminder emails and texts started rolling to whoever bothered to put their name on the accounts, my name would not be there to clean it up, and that small shift felt like a tectonic plate moving, invisible to the eye yet massive in effect. Somewhere in that quiet, I realized I had one more thread to pull that would matter in a very concrete way without turning me into the villain they like to paint when confronted, which was the professional thread they tug when they want to look competent by borrowing my competence, the references and introductions I provide, the calendar blocks I create, the documents I write and send for them to sign. All the invisible clerical work an oldest daughter learns to perform without complaint. I opened my email and drafted a single, short, neutral note to the extended family and the handful of friends who always route errands and signatures through me, stating that I am stepping back from logistical support and that any accounts, subscriptions, or plans that have relied on my administration or payments will need to be updated by the end of the current cycle. And I hit send with the same calm I had when I hit block, because a boundary stated in plain language is not an attack, it is information. The first hint that the silence was finally echoing back came not from my parents or my sister, since they were blocked and therefore had to stew without an outlet, but from an aunt who screenshotted a group chat meltdown and forwarded it with a note that said, "I do not know what happened, but your mother is spiraling," and in the screenshot I watched the familiar script unspool in real time. The frantic claims that I had misunderstood, the fierce defense of my sister's trip because she has been under stress and deserved a break, the casual rewriting of the last 4 years as a lovable blur where everyone tried their best, and then, underneath, the part that made me sit very still, which was my sister chiming in with a line about how some people are just jealous and create problems for attention, and I felt something like a laugh rise up, not bitter, just clear, because when you are that certain the sun rises for you, any cloud looks like sabotage. I did not reply to my aunt, and I did not unblock anyone to explain myself, and when my cousin texted from an unknown number asking if my phone was broken because mom said I was unreachable, I let it sit. And when a coworker pinged me to say my sister had posted a story about toxic people who hold grudges and leech off family while pretending to be martyrs, I did not go look, because I already know the flavor of that soup and I do not need to taste it again. What I needed was to keep my hands still and wait for the second beat, the one where the small invisible machines I have kept running for years begin to slow, and the room that has taken me for granted realizes the air was not automatic after all. By early evening, the voicemails from blocked numbers were arriving as transcriptions that started with my name and moved swiftly to accusations that I had humiliated everyone by making a scene, which is always rich coming from people who cannot see a boundary unless it is written as a billboard, and I read them the way you read the weather, with curiosity but without obligation, and while I was reading, another email confirmation hit my inbox stating that the family sharing group had been Dissolved due to change of owner, which meant the apps and storage and premium access that have felt like air and water to them would now prompt them to enter their own cards, and I sat there feeling the smallest, sharpest satisfaction. Not because they would be inconvenienced tonight, but because the story would finally have to change tomorrow. The revenge in this chapter, if you want to call it that, was not a public blast or a dramatic speech. It was a surgical removal of the scaffolding that let them treat me like a backstage pass to comfort without ever paying the ticket cost of basic respect. And the moment I pressed remove on the last shared toggle and watched it confirm that I was no longer the person holding their safety net, I knew the next day would not belong to me or to their vacation photos. It would belong to the consequences of what they have trained themselves to ignore, and that is when the real noise began, because within minutes a new number popped up with a voicemail I did not answer, a voice I know too well in a tone I have never heard, starting with the words, "What did you do?" and carrying a kind of panic that told me the lights had finally flickered. The first voicemail transcription read like a weather alert delivered in my father's voice, a clipped demand wrapped around a wobble he probably thought I could not hear, telling me to call back immediately because something had gone wrong with the accounts. And by accounts, he meant the invisible net I had held under everyone for years, the auto-pays and logins and subscriptions and calendars that made life feel smooth for them while I quietly learned every system and patched every leak. And as I watched the text of his message scroll across my screen, I felt the old reflex twitch in my chest, that practiced move where I drop whatever I am doing and pick up the rag to mop the floor before anyone else notices the spill. And I let the reflex flare and die without moving because I finally understood that if I kept solving their messes, I would spend the rest of my life apologizing for making boundaries they had no intention of respecting. The next ripple came from an unknown number that turned out to be my sister using a hotel phone with an exasperated concierge translating her fury into politeness. Because apparently the shared storage I had been paying for prompted her to add a card when she tried to dump a new batch of travel photos into the family album. And nothing is as unacceptable to a lifelong headliner as a prompt that does not vanish when she tilts her head and smiles, and while the concierge read a carefully worded request for me to fix whatever this is, I thanked him for his time, told him I could not help, and hung up with a steadiness that felt like learning a new language in real time. One where my job is not to make sure my sister's narrative continues uninterrupted at my expense. By mid-morning, I had a small stack of forwarded screenshots in my inbox from a cousin who loves drama more than she loves anyone involved in it, showing the family group chat going from confident outrage to logistical panic as the streaming bundle asked for a new owner. The phone plan app displayed a notice about a pending change. And the shared calendar where I once color-coded everyone's appointments had mysteriously reverted to a basic template with no admin privileges, and the chorus, as always, circled back to me, because when the machine stalls you do not scream at the star of the show, you look for the stagehand who knows where the switches are, and for the first time in a very long time there was no stagehand within reach. Because I had walked off without a speech or a scene, and the absence itself was doing the talking. I wish I could tell you I floated through the day with perfect serenity, but that would be a lie, because there is nothing clean about retraining a lifetime of being useful. And there were moments where my hands hovered over the keyboard while my brain rehearsed the same old script about being reasonable and de-escalating and not making things harder than they need to be. And in those moments, I reminded myself that making it easier for everyone else had turned into making it impossible for me. So I filled the space with practical steps that served me rather than them, starting with a credit report check to confirm there were no stray authorized user surprises, followed by removing the last ghost card from a store account my mother had used years ago for holiday shopping, and finishing with a simple freeze on my credit because a recent comment from my father about putting utilities in your name for the discount had once sounded like family teamwork and now sounded like an invitation to future headaches I had no intention of accepting. Around lunchtime, the front desk pinged me to say my parents were in the lobby asking for me, and old me would have bolted down the stairs to manage the optics and calm the scene because I hate creating trouble for people who did not cause it. While Numi had already sent a quiet note to the desk the day before explaining that unannounced visitors should be told I was not available without an appointment, and that if anyone insisted they were family, the answer should remain the same, and when. The receptionist typed back that she had given them the message, and they were not happy but were leaving, I sat in a conference room with my hands in my lap and felt something like a click, not a victory dance and not a heartbreak. Just the unmistakable sensation of a hinge finally moving in the direction it was designed to move. The voicemails kept stacking into a litany of guilt and theater, lines about how I was embarrassing them by making a spectacle out of nothing, about how my sister's trip had been planned for weeks and could not be moved, about how adults do not count birthdays like children, all of which might have landed if they had not been layered on top of 4 straight years of me being treated like a background actor who holds the boom mic while the lead gets her close-up. And tucked under the moralizing was the practical problem they could not fix without me, which was that a handful of services and comforts needed a card and a manager and a password keeper, and the person who had always filled those roles had stopped volunteering. Sometime in the afternoon, my bank sent a push notification about a declined attempt from a resort boutique in my sister's city for a card of mine that had been stored on file years ago during a family trip. A card I had long since replaced, but which evidently still sat in a profile somewhere as a convenient default, and I will not pretend I did not feel a sharp, satisfied pulse when I saw that the transaction failed. Not because I wanted my sister embarrassed at a counter, but because I wanted the universe to mirror back the small truth I had said to myself that morning, which is that I am done underwriting the story where I am obligated to fund and fix the things that erase me. And while I stared at the notification, another unknown number rang and dropped a voicemail full of outrage about how the boutique manager had made her call security over a declined card and how I had set her up. Which is a wild accusation when you are the person who has spent years quietly keeping everyone from ever hitting that wall. Toward early evening, I made one deliberate move that felt like revenge to anyone on the outside and like oxygen to me, which was sending a single, calm message to the small professional circle my family reliably contacts when they want pressure applied. The church friend who calls to broker peace, the neighbor who plays messenger, the cousin who loves to stir, and the note said that I would not be taking calls about family matters and that anyone who tried to triangulate by using work or community channels would be met with silence, that I was well, that I was busy, and that this is not a crisis, it is an update to terms. And I pressed send without apology because if you want peace to stick, you have to close the side doors people used to sneak in with chaos. You could argue I was being cold, and maybe you would be right, although I do not think choosing not to be a hallway counts as cruelty. And if you want the moment where the audience throws their head back and says, finally, here it is. Because just before I left the office, my phone flashed one last transcription from an unknown number. My father again, this time in the tone he saves for serious business, informing me that if I did not call back that night, he would be involving a lawyer because I had sabotaged family property, and I put the phone face down and smiled without joy because a threat is just an admission dressed up like a plan, and if he wanted a formal conversation, then a formal conversation is exactly what he was going to get. Which is why I walked home and opened a folder on my laptop labeled receipts, pulled 4 years of payments and confirmation numbers into a clean ledger with dates and descriptions and totals written out in words, and prepared the one reply I knew would land without a raised voice or a single insult, a reply that started with a simple sentence about ownership and consent and ended with a sentence about reimbursement schedules and the date by which any dispute should be raised in writing. And when I hit save instead of send, I felt the cliff edge under my feet in the best way, because the next step would not be noise, it would be paper. The next morning began not with peace or clarity, but with an inbox already bloated by messages that looked less like communication and more like staged press releases, each one written as though I were the audience they needed to persuade rather than the daughter they had neglected, and it struck me with almost comic sharpness that for years they had rehearsed lines about love, unity, and sacrifice. Lines they pasted beneath photographs and delivered in holiday toasts, yet when confronted with the reality that I had withdrawn the quiet labor that made their comfort possible, they resorted not to apologies or reflection, but to open spin, posts on social media about betrayal, captions about ungrateful people. Stories about toxic family members who erase themselves from the bond that matters most. And while I might once have panicked at the optics, once have rushed in to clarify or defend myself, this time I let them put on their show because I finally understood the only thing more destructive than their favoritism was my cooperation in making it look respectable. It did not take long for the spin to collapse into logistical collapse, because when you build a house on someone else's back, eventually the floor caves when they stand up straight. And by noon I was already hearing from extended relatives about how the phone plan had locked at least one family member out of their voicemail, how the streaming services now required fresh logins, how the family calendar had lost every color-coded note about medical appointments and school events, and I could picture the chaos not as an abstraction, but as a vivid tangle of missed reminders and broken routines that had always landed on me to prevent. And though there was a flicker of guilt, there was also an undeniable sense of balance, as if the universe were finally showing them the truth I had lived alone for too long, the truth that love is not proven by speeches about loyalty, but by the unglamorous work of showing up, and I had shown up while they had simply shown off. My mother's message arrived in the form of a desperate chain of paragraphs that read like a mixture of panic and moral sermon, telling me that I had humiliated her by airing family business through neglect, that people were asking questions she could not answer, that my sister was in tears and could not upload the photos she wanted to post because the storage limits were suddenly real, and buried inside that guilt-soaked lecture was the clearest admission they had ever given me without knowing it, an admission that all of their performances, their celebrations, their curated version of love depended on a backbone they never acknowledged but always leaned on, and now that backbone had finally stopped bending. For years I had been the quiet enabler, the one who told myself that fairness is an illusion and that families are complicated, that people show love differently. That maybe I was overreacting by expecting my birthday to register on their radar in the same way my sisters did, yet reading that message erased every rationalization. Because the tears they shed now were not about missing me or realizing the pain they had caused, they were about losing the infrastructure of ease I had provided, the convenience of never having to think about the mechanics behind their joy, and the fury they directed at me proved that the absence of my compliance had more impact than the presence of my loyalty ever did. Later in the afternoon, one final attempt to spin the story into their favor landed like a slap disguised as a hug, because my sister, never one to waste an opportunity to play the victim, posted a long caption video about forgiveness. How family should forgive mistakes, how she was ready to forgive me if I apologized for cutting everyone off, as though the crime here was not 4 years of neglect, but the audacity of me drawing a boundary, and watching the comments roll in from her friends, calling her strong, kind, and magnanimous. I did not feel rage or despair. I felt clarity so sharp it was almost physical, because if you have to frame yourself as a saint forgiving someone you have been actively ignoring and dismissing for years, then your halo is made of tin, and all the applause in the world cannot change the fact that your story is cracking at its core. What they could not hide, not with posts and not with outrage, was the fact that every person who had watched their annual parades for my sister now also watched the silence around me, and that silence was not benign, it was deafening. Because once you start looking you cannot unsee it, and suddenly relatives who had once cheered their captions started asking small, careful questions, started comparing dates, started noticing the patterns I had carried alone, and for the first time the spotlight that had always been so perfectly staged on my sister wobbled, flickered, revealed the missing pieces in the scenery, and it rattled them more than anything I could have said with words. I knew I had to make one more move, not out of spite, but out of the need to draw a final line that could not be redrawn, so I logged back into the group album, exported every photograph of myself and every memory that had my name attached, and then deleted them from the shared archive, not because I wanted to erase history, but because I refused to leave pieces of my life curated by people who never cared to celebrate me, and with a few clicks I made it impossible for them to use my face in their staged nostalgia. And if that sounds harsh, consider that for years they had used my silence as a backdrop for their noise, so taking away that backdrop was not cruelty, it was correction. The aftermath was immediate and predictable. A new wave of voicemails accusing me of being vindictive, cousins messaging that my parents were devastated, even a friend of my sister's sliding into my inbox with a lecture about how you don't just delete family history because you're hurt, and I could only shake my head at how completely they missed the point, because history is not erased when photographs vanish from a folder, it is erased when people actively choose to ignore it in real time. And that was exactly what they had done to me for 4 consecutive years, erasing me on the days when it mattered most, and now they wanted to cry foul because I refused to preserve their curated narrative. That night, as the noise surged around me like static, I did something I had not done in years. I cooked dinner, poured a glass of wine, and ate in silence without my phone buzzing in my hand or my calendar flashing reminders of other people's needs. And it hit me that the very thing they accused me of, making a spectacle, was the opposite of what I had actually done, because I had not posted a word, had not made a single announcement, had not asked anyone to take my side. I had simply withdrawn my labor, my funding, my presence, and watched as the vacuum revealed the hollowness of their love, and that revelation was worth more to me than any public vindication could ever be. The collapse of their performance was not loud in my ears, it was loud in theirs, because for the first time in their carefully managed theater of favoritism, the curtain had dropped without warning, and instead of applause there was silence. And instead of adoration there were questions, and instead of a convenient daughter who smoothed the edges there was a woman who no longer played along, and if that left them scrambling for explanations while I sat quietly in my apartment, then so be it. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge is not the fire you set, but the oxygen you refuse to supply. When the call finally came, it was not from a number I recognized, but from a line I could tell my father had borrowed, probably because he had realized that the block would not break no matter how many times he tried. And as the transcript began to roll onto my screen, I could almost hear the clipped tone, the same tone he used when talking to contractors or bank managers, a voice designed to intimidate and to reestablish control. And in that message, he told me in no uncertain terms that if I did not call him back that very evening he would be taking legal action for what he called sabotaging family property, and I laughed without laughter because the irony was almost too much. The man who had spent 4 years telling me that birthdays are for children and that grown adults should not expect fanfare was now threatening to get a lawyer because his daughter had decided not to keep paying his bills in silence. I did not reply with panic or with rage, I replied with preparation, because if there is one thing I have learned it is that people who depend on your silence assume you will never document anything, so I opened my laptop, pulled out every receipt, every statement, every confirmation email, and built a ledger so clean and so undeniable that even a lawyer would have to stop mid-sentence, a ledger showing 4 years of payments I had made to keep their comforts intact, with dates, descriptions, and totals written out in words, so there would be no mistaking the fact that the person accused of sabotage was in fact the person who had been underwriting their entire illusion of stability while being erased from their emotional lives. And when I saved that file under a simple name, Family Accounts, I realized that for the first time in years I was not preparing for another round of excuses, I was preparing for my own freedom. The following day, my sister made her last, most desperate attempt at controlling the story, sending a private message through a new account that started with the words, "You've ruined everything," and then spiraled into accusations that I was jealous, bitter, and attention-seeking, and I let the words sit there without replying, because replying would have been playing her game, the same game I had been forced into year after year where she was the princess on stage and I was the invisible stagehand making sure the lights stayed on, and now that the lights were off she could not perform, so she reached for the only script she had ever memorized, the one where I am the villain and she is the victim. And I let her scream into the void, because the void was the only place her script belonged. The meltdown grew public when my mother, in a last attempt to shame me back into place, called a relative gathering and apparently explained to everyone that I had cut myself out of the family over a misunderstanding. But the flaw in her story was that she had to explain around the missing pieces, and missing pieces are louder than words, so instead of nodding along the way they always had, people began asking the questions she had always been able to deflect. Like why my sister had been given a surprise trip abroad on the very day of my birthday, why no one could remember the last time they had even acknowledged my day, why so many bills and services had been run quietly through my accounts for years, and why I had walked away without saying a word. Because silence, when it is finally chosen after years of swallowing pain, carries more weight than the loudest accusation. I did not need to be in that room to know what was happening because the texts began leaking in from extended relatives who were confused, who were saying things like, "We had no idea it was this lopsided, and now it makes sense why you disappeared." And even though I did not answer those messages either, I read them with a sense of steady vindication, because for years I had felt like I was going crazy, like maybe I was overreacting, like maybe I was the one being unfair, and now the truth was playing out on its own, in their words, without my prompting, and that truth was reshaping the story more effectively than anything I could have shouted in anger. The final act of revenge, if you can call it that, was not about cutting them off or exposing them publicly, it was about reclaiming control over my narrative. And I did that not by writing long posts or making declarations, but by simply living without them, by showing them that I could function, eat, work, rest, and even laugh without the constant chaos of their demands in my ear, and that absence, that refusal to play along, did more damage to their carefully crafted roles than any fight ever could have, because they had built their sense of authority on my compliance, and when the compliance vanished, so did the illusion of power. In the end, I never sent the ledger to a lawyer, though I had it ready, because the threat itself evaporated once they realized how exposed they were, and instead of receiving a lawsuit, I received nothing, not even an apology. Just a dragging silence that confirmed they finally understood that the game was over, that I was not bluffing, that I was not waiting for them to come back with flowers or excuses, and that by blocking them and refusing to step back into the role they had written for me, I had rewritten the story entirely, a story where I was not the background character, but the one who had the final word. So when people ask me now if I regret it, if I miss them, if I think maybe I went too far, I answer honestly that I regret nothing, because what I gained was not a family reunion or a seat at a table that never had room for me. What I gained was the knowledge that I no longer need their permission to matter, and that is worth more than any surprise trip or birthday cake could ever be, because they wanted me invisible, they wanted me silent, and now, even in my absence, they cannot stop talking about me, and that, in the strangest way possible, is the most powerful revenge I could have ever chosen.